Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
This is your time. This is your call to arms. For the Cryptid Connection is your voice. I'm your host, Jennifer.
And I'm your host, Stephen. Welcome to Cryptid Connection.
The Cryptid Connection podcast is brought to you by CryptidConnection.com, a website dedicated to you, one who has interest in all things cryptid and paranormal. CC is a place where you can enjoy a hassle-free lifestyle and community of Bigfoot pursuit. Stop by via the internet and visit. Guarantee you will start to feel at home. CryptidConnection.com. We are glad you decided to listen to Cryptid Connection tonight. We have Daniel Perez with us in the studio, who is an author and publisher of Sasquatch material. He has been involved in the community for over 30 years. Daniel, welcome, and thank you for the opportunity. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and I'm based in Los Angeles for the people who are listening.
Oh, thank you. Hey, could you go ahead and elaborate a little bit about that? We have some newbies, obviously, that listen to us, and we would like to learn a little bit more about yourself. Would you introduce yourself to us tonight, please?
56 years old. My occupation is that of a union licensed electrician, and I've been in that occupation since 1985. So at the present time, I'm closer to being retired than any more work. I got interested in the subject by the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek, and I went to go see it at a walk-in theater with my older brother and older sister, and that was about 1973. And I didn't know anything about Bigfoot prior to that time. And even at the time, in 1973, when I was about 10 years old, I was maybe skeptical by nature, whether I knew it or not. And so I thought we were just going to see a monster movie, you know, because kids like to see monster movies, Godzilla and so forth. And so when I left that theater, all I could say is that that movie had a profound impact on me. It hit me like a ton of bricks, if you will. And frankly, I didn't know whether I should believe any of the people that were featured in the movie as to what they claimed to have happened. So I went to the library, and somehow I found out that all of this Boggy Creek stuff was kind of like Bigfoot stuff. And so there happened to be some books on the subject, and I started to check them out in some magazines, and one thing led to another, and that's how I became interested in the subject matter. And from that time to this time, I've stuck with it and became more interested in it.
Okay. So that's what got you interested in everything. What happened that, I mean, there has to be an evolution here.
What happened is I kept going back to the library, and it just happened to be, I lived in Norwalk at the time, and there were two other people in Whittier at the time who had founded, because there was no internet at the time, they just started a group called the Southwestern Bigfoot Research Team. And the principals at the time were Doug Trapp and I think Corey Rudolph. And they left one of their business cards in one of the books that I checked out. And I took that business card and I called the number, and so they came over to my house to visit, and we ended up talking till past midnight. And I remember I had to go to school the next day. I guess school started at 8 o'clock or whatever. And I was very tired. But they were of the mindset that we should do field research. And so we went on, not expeditions, but camping trips. And one was here in the San Gabriel Mountains. And one later on, just myself and Doug Trapp, tracks were being reported and sightings were being reported in an area called Hemet, California. And for those readers, to give you a crash course, you could just kind of visually think of Hemet, California, between Los Angeles and San Diego, kind of halfway in between. And so another researcher who was well known at the time, he's still known to a lot of people, Peter Gatella, was our lead investigator who told us about this activity because he was subscribing to a newspaper clipping service. And the principals, the people who were having the activity were, they're probably deceased now, Dick and June Putnam. And what had happened, there was sightings and there was footprints, and some of this found its way into the newspapers. And so Doug and I, I think this was 1980, made a decision, because we had been out there before, made a decision to go out and talk with these people again to see if there was any continuing activity. And so we drove out there, and as I recall, this was the weekend, as I recall, it had rained quite a bit just before that weekend. And so we get out there, and there was no Dick and June Putnam at their house. And so we said, okay. And back then there was no cell phone. So we said, okay, what to do now? And we said, well, let's just drive around and look around, you know. And so nobody knew we were going, number one. And number two, we didn't even know we were just driving around, because at the time this area wasn't really developed at all. It was just kind of rolling hills and trees and stuff. And so we started driving down a dirt road, and the road was so rutted from the rain that you kind of had to get off the dirt road and kind of go onto the shoulder and then come back to miss all the rutting in the road so you didn't get your car stuck. And so Doug made a decision. He says, why don't we just stop right here and just go look around? And there was a creek in the area, and so we were just killing time, if you will. And so we started walking around, and there was a tree or several trees and a small creek that you could just literally walk across. And I guess the creek was there because of the extensive rain. And then we're looking down at the ground, at the dirt, and both of us kind of said, like, holy cow. And there were tracks. And it's just like, all I could say, if somebody faked those tracks, they sure as hell didn't know we were coming, because we didn't even know we were going to be there. It was just, we were just looking around. So we see these tracks, and to my memory, they were about 17 inches long, kind of narrow. They weren't in the best of shape, and presumably because of the rain. And so we tried to make some plaster castings of the track, and Doug had some plaster in a box in his trunk, but to my memory, that plaster was kind of moist, I think. So it didn't set up well in the print, and so our attempt at making a plaster casting was futile in the sense that it just all got washed away. But I did take some pictures, and what I really remember back in 1980 is the very well pronounced heel of the track, and the front area wasn't that discernible, but I took pictures anyway. And both Doug and I were very convinced that what we were looking at was something had gone through there in that area. What time, I don't know, but there were the tracks. And so by 1980, I was like, wow, there seems to be something to this mystery. And so that kind of, in terms of my evolution, that kind of got me even more interested. And mind you, I was 17 at the time, and I didn't know that now that I'm 56, that this topic would consume so much of my time and my energy and my financial resources up to this point. And that the issue, the Bigfoot mystery, would become even bigger, partly fueled by the internet, partly fueled by television. And so that's kind of how I got going. And in 1982, not 1982, but 1980 as well, I took a trip in the summer with the then active Texas Bigfoot research, the Bigfoot research team, I think, that came from Texas that was going to go up to the Bluff Creek area in the summer, and I went with them. And it was kind of like a group. This was really a small expedition, and they were going to go up to the Patterson-Gimlin film site. And I just said, hey, yeah, count me in. And so I was able to go with them. And so when I got up there, let me think. Yeah, so I got up there, we did this trip, and I really saw how dense the forest was up in Northern California and the potential for things to be in those woods that could be completely hidden from most people. And so that same summer, to the best of my recollection, I did another trip up to Washington State, and this was with Peter Gatella, and this was to the Snohomish area, and there was activity up there. So it was kind of a very full summer for me, just before my senior year in high school. And then I get a hold of Doug Trapp, who had moved up to Washington State, and he said that he called me. Somehow, it's been a long time, but somehow we got a hold of one another. And he said that, hey, Renee DeHinden from Canada wants to meet you. And would I go up to see him up in Canada? And so I went from there up to Canada to meet Renee DeHinden. And let's see, yeah, that was summer of 1980. So Doug and I went to go visit him, and that was very interesting.
Right at about the same time, am I correct that you had already started your first newsletter?
Yes, and the first newsletter by 1980, because my dad bought one of those, I forget the name of the typewriter, but it was an electric typewriter. And because I was in high school, my sister was in high school, my brother had just got out of high school, and there was no computers at the time we didn't have one, but we had an electric typewriter. And so that was for our term papers and that sort of stuff. And then I just, I was getting all this Bigfoot information from correspondence from the mail. And then I thought to myself, I should really publish some of this stuff so I could share it with people who are interested. And so in Los Angeles, what was big at the time was the Los Angeles Times. So I said, well, how about I just start? I was 16, something like that at the time. And I said, why don't I just start the Bigfoot Times, like the LA Times, but just about Bigfoot? And so I made it one word, Bigfoot Times, 1T, Bigfoot Times. And so that was the first newsletter I ever started. And so by 1980, I was publishing a newsletter, and I think we had all of, don't quote me, but we're here on it doing an interview, maybe 37, 40 subscribers. And it wasn't, I didn't do it to make money. I did it because there wasn't a whole lot of information out there. It was far different than it is today. And so I said, I'll put this newsletter out and people will read it, and I'll send it. And it went all over the place. And so I was very happy to be part of that early Bigfoot community. with the first version of the Bigfoot Times. So you are correct. There was a newsletter at the time.
Already you've surprised me because I actually was not aware of how much field work you had in the beginning. That was actually a big question mark as far as your resume.
Yeah, and it's funny because a lot of the field research that I've done has not yielded anything that is earth-shattering. So needless to say, it doesn't really get out there. But yeah, by 1980, and it's just like I credit Doug Trapp with getting me out in the field, because I may have been just a desk-bound academic who really had no interest in the field until he took me out. And, you know, had we not seen those tracks, and what was interesting about seeing the tracks in 1980 is that the light bulb went off, in the sense that prior to this, that the people in that area had sightings and had seen tracks, and from Dick and June Putnam, who had, and their family members and friends who had reported it in this area. And so when we saw tracks, it was like that eureka moment. And I said, wow, this is very interesting. So yeah, the field research started pretty early.
Okay, let me ask you about this. Other than just your newsletter, which I think is probably the thing you're most famous for, and we'll get into that in a second, or at least the current version of it, you have also written several books. Do you mind talking about those and telling us a little bit of what they're about and how people might be able to find them?
My most famous publication was Bigfoot at Bluff Creek. And so it dawned on me, closing in on the 25th anniversary of the Patterson-Gimlin film, that I had mentioned to my good colleague at the time, Renee DeHinden. I said, you know, we're approaching 25 years, a quarter century of the famous movie, and no one has really published something on the 25-year mark. And I said, I'm thinking of doing something like a little booklet. And so my booklet, Bigfoot at Bluff Creek, at least according to the critics, turned out to be like the Bible of the Patterson-Gimlin film at the time. Originally published in 1994, and then in 2003, on the eve of the International Sasquatch Symposium in Willow Creek, California, I republished it, printed more copies because I knew I would sell a ton of them up there. And the only thing I did that was different in it, the second edition, if you will, has a very extensive bibliography in it. So with that being said, bibliography, I'll mention one project that just got completed. And in 1988, I published a book called Bigfoot Notes, and it was just short of 200 pages, and it was a reference work. And it was all the references I could find on Bigfoot from up to that point that went all the way into the past that I could find. And so that was like my first project, the Bigfoot Notes. And then in 2011, or right about there, I teamed up with an artist by the name of Stephen DeMarco, and we published a young adult book called Bigfoot Encounters. And that, I think we self-published 1,000 copies, and I think I've got maybe 30 copies left. And there was self-published and color images and stuff. And Stephen had mentioned to me quite recently, he said, you know, prior to our book, a fully illustrated young adult book, he says, I don't think anyone had done anything quite like that at the time. And I said, you know, I don't know that to be fact, but from memory, I don't remember too many other people who have done something of that nature. So I was quite happy to hear that, and quite happy to have made that contribution. And in fact, that book was called Bigfoot Encounters Past to Present. That's the title. And it's still available on Amazon as a digital.
Wow. That is quite a history. Over the years, you have had a unique position to observe. How has everything changed? What do you feel is better and what do you feel is worse in regards to the Bigfoot research?
Well, what's changed everything is that the internet changed everything. And then as the internet evolved, along came this thing that was part of the internet, social media. And I suspect a lot of people in the Bigfoot community today have nothing to do with Bigfoot. It just happens to be kind of a social type of activity, and it's based more on likes rather than finding physical evidence for the subject that we're looking for. So that might be good, might not be bad, but that's just a commentary about the subject in general. And with the internet, of course, with email and stuff, you could exchange a lot of data really fast. But what I've seen with many of the websites or many of the things that you find on Facebook, you've got all of these very interesting reports, but there's no names attached to them. And so without a name, you can't assess the credibility of the eyewitness. It could be anybody. And it's just like, so someone saw something crossing the road and whoever's controlling that information does not mention the name of the person. And, for all we know, it could be the town drunk who's made numerous false claims prior to that time. And so the report could be completely worthless. So I always say, if you don't have a name, that's the first thing to be leery about when it comes to digesting this information. And secondly, at any given time, you could go on YouTube and find the next blob squatch video of a Bigfoot. And needless to say, to conceal everything, if it's a fake, is that there's no name attached to it, who took the video, and there's no exact location. Unlike the Patterson-Gimlin film, where you had your two eyewitnesses, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, and within the day that the location of the incident was out for anyone. And so there was nothing concealed about that. So it's completely different today. It's just like everything's under wraps. You don't know the name of the person or the eyewitness, and you don't know the exact location when it comes to these Bigfoot videos. And so I always like to tell people, when in doubt, throw it out.
All right. Now that brings up a little bit of a question I want to ask you. You said go out to, let's say, YouTube, to example, and you can see these videos, and you'll see all these red flags. But if someone actually caught a legitimate video, are you of the opinion that the last place it would be is actually on YouTube?
Hard to say.
And I guess what I'm sitting there saying is, being in the internet age, I understand fully what you're saying about having the full history, full identity, all the information associated with the video. But, and I guess what I'm saying is, I'm sitting here thinking it should be very limited distribution to just the correct people, because if it's thrown out on YouTube, people naturally aren't going to say a specific location, for example. They may give a state and a county or something like that. What's your position? Do you think that that's just something they have to bite? Or, I guess the flip of the question is, what do they do?
My position on it, for the serious investigator and researcher, it doesn't allow further investigation. And on a few occasions, I've made inquiries to get more information about said videos, alleged Bigfoot videos, and no response. So I'm at the point where it's just like, okay, if they don't want to respond where we could go do an investigation, well, then I wash my hands of the entire matter. But that being said, I do want to discuss one incident from November of 2005. I guess your listeners could correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think this was November of 2005, and it involves an individual, a hiker from the state of Washington, Randy Chase. And so I originally saw the report on the BFRO website, and the initials that accompanied the report were RC, which proved to be correct, RC Randy Chase. And so right around this time, I think it was 2006 or thereabouts, Cliff Barackman was living at Long Beach at the time. And he jingled me and he wanted to come and visit. And I said, yeah, I got some time, and we spent a good part of the day together having an off the record conversation. And this, I brought up to him because he was a member of the BFRO at the time. And I brought up to him about this report I had read on the website. And he goes, he had mentioned, he says, oh, you mean Randy Chase? And I said, oh, is that the name of the guy? And he says, yeah. And he says, I spoke with him. He's a really good guy and a really good report. And he was up in Washington State hiking by himself, November of 2005, if I've got my dates correct, on Silver Store Mountain. And when he got towards the top of the peak, kind of an easy hike, but it was, at the time, there was snow on the ground and the weather was freezing. But this guy does hiking in all sorts of weather. And so he gets up there and he sees something. He sees something that at first he thought to be a rock, and then it moved. And then he had his digital camera with him, which he eventually gave to me. So it's in my possession now. And I said, well, if we ever want to do testing with the exact camera, I have it. And so he takes, I think, a series of photos, 3 or 4 images. And those images have all the hallmarks of a Bigfoot. And so here's a case that's on the internet where, when questioned, that we do know the name of the eyewitness and we do know the exact location. And I went up to investigate. I did my first field investigation there in June 2009, right after the Yakima Bigfoot Roundup. And I had called Randy Chase by phone. And I said, listen, I'm coming up to Washington State. I'd like to meet you. And I had met him on the phone, did an interview by phone in 2006. And then 2009, I said, I'd like to know if you'd be willing to take me hike up there, and would go hike up to the area and you tell me what happened and everything. And so right after the Yakima Bigfoot Roundup, I drove to, I guess, the Seattle area where Randy lives. And then from there, and we spent a whole day together, and I did a videotaped interview of him. And I was extremely impressed by him as a witness, and I was extremely impressed by the images he shot, and extremely impressed by the area where this incident took place. And so there's a case where, a later day case where all the information is known, the eyewitness, photographic evidence, the exact location. And even to this day, he says, I'm not sure what I saw, but I saw something, and I took pictures of it. And it looks like a Bigfoot.
All right, that sounds interesting. That is a good example of a later event case that you were able to go back and verify, and because you were able to get the information necessary. And that brings up a very good point I want to bring to serious investigators, or people who want to be a serious investigator. It's always to fully document everything you possibly can. And that's actually one thing that I'm really impressed with, because in the Bigfoot community, you've been the documenter. You are literally like the archivist, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, you're going down the checklist, so to speak.
And you've got You've got everything, and you've been continuous throughout all these years. How have you kept it
Right.
up?
Because of my interest. It's almost like if you could imagine for a moment that if I were a drug addict or an alcoholic, that I would be so consumed by getting the next drink or the next fix or the next needle that I would, do whatever it took to do it, to get that. But thank God I'm not into that stuff. I'm into Bigfoot. And so I continue to feed that passion by trying to stay up on top of things and to get information. And a lot of people send me books for reviews. Recently, Chad Arment sent a copy of his just released The Historical Bigfoot, and Ken Gerhard sent a copy of his Bigfoot book, and Mark Mersell, if I'm saying his name correctly, sent me a copy of his Ape Canyon book. And so with those review copies, which eventually find their way onto promotions by me on Facebook or in my newsletter, I'm helping them out, and I'm also doing the Bigfoot community a service by telling these people about these books that, hey, you should buy this book, that there's some valuable information to be seen in it. And so I'm continually feeding my habit and I find it, how can I say it? I find it more than extremely interesting. And then Shelley Covington Montana, I believe that's her full name. She had mentioned to me when I first met her in 2017, she goes, you're a Bigfoot historian. And I kind of cringed at that because it kind of made me feel old. And I said, well, you could call me what you want, but I guess I am a little bit of a historian. But like everyone else, I'm also just your everyday interested party in the current research and investigation of Bigfoot. So that when they say historian or whatever, it just kind of makes me feel old, and it's just like, but whatever, they can call me what they will. And I will make mention that I have in my possession the world's largest files on the topic in terms of physical files, not digital files.
With all of those years with your publications, I believe that. I bet it's an incredible collection.
It's stunning like no other. And I have booklets and stuff that was published long ago in small, limited supplies that you can't find any of this stuff anymore on eBay or anywhere else. So, for instance, the lady from Willow Creek that was investigating in the late 1950s, her name escapes me, Betty Allen. She wrote a book, a booklet, I can't think of the name, but I have an original copy of it in the original envelope, and that was published in the 60s. And George Haas bought a copy. And so when George passed away, his colleague Warren Thompson inherited all of his information. And so when Warren Thompson passed away, I inherited the entire collection. So it made my own collection probably grow 10 times in size overnight. So I've got a stunning collection.
And quite a legacy, sounds like.
Yeah, and it's quite a legacy, and I just hope that another generation has access to this material. And so my plan is, once I'm dead, that probably all of my files will be donated to Stanford University, and that another generation could have access to a lot of this information.
That's very generous.
A lot of it is original material in terms of some of the taped sessions with eyewitnesses that both Warren and George did back in the day before I came into the picture. And I just think that because a lot of people take the subject very seriously and think that there's a physical animal behind it, that I think it's going to be important for another generation to have access to this material. And I think Stanford University, with their immense resources, would probably be a good place to house it.
I want to touch back a little bit on the changes, or the concept of the idea of changes over time in the Bigfoot world that you have witnessed. How has Sasquatch itself evolved, do you feel? And I'll preface that with saying that we're very much flesh and blood, and we're still looking for the exact same creature that was seen in the 60s and the 50s and the time before. But the social image of it has evolved, and the flood of information and misinformation about it, especially with the internet, has come out. There are certain characteristics and behaviors, for example, that very few people knew about, say, in the 90s. Let's say like rock throwing. Rock throwing was not a common behavior that was openly talked about that much. I can't think of very many books that often mentioned that behavior. Just using it as an example, what have you seen, and how do you think that changed? I mean, because most of the world, I don't think, is looking for that Sasquatch anymore.
I think maybe there's some missed observations or missed details over the years in terms of specifics, because as I read Chad Arment's The Historical Bigfoot, there's a lot of references to these things being near trees or up trees. And the more I listen and read about cases, there seems to be an association with Bigfoot in trees. And I don't know how that could be, but if this is what the eyewitnesses are saying, Chad Arment's book, The Historical Bigfoot, that talks about reports prior to 1958, there's a lot of references to that. And even today, there are references to people saying, like, I saw something up in a tree. The rock throwing, as I'm reading Chad Arment's book, the early references, there probably is not a lot of them, but as I recall, there are some. And then I think the other comment you made, let's see, you talked about rock throwing, but if you look at, say, like John Green's book, who wrote 3 booklets and then 1 book, and then he updated another version, which was essentially a compilation of some of his earlier works with some updating. And I think if you read through some of the literature that in Green's book, that the rock throwing is there. And then the late John Bindernagel talks about rock throwing too, and then makes the carryover that this is a typical characteristics of apes in Africa, that this is what you would call common primate behavior, and he's trying to tie the two together. And so I think some of those comments or specific behaviors that you have mentioned have been there for a long time, but perhaps we've never noticed them. And then one thing about Bigfoot that I had mentioned to Green back in the 70s, John Green, is that I said there are some references to these things being on all fours and then walking on 2 legs as well. And then as I'm reading Chad Arment's book, The Historical Bigfoot, there's a ton of references of these things. And as I'm reading the book, I'm taking my pen and underlining this stuff, and then on the side, taking my own little notes, like on all fours. And that I had mentioned to Green, and he, back then when people were writing snail mail letters, he wrote back to me and he said, these things might not be as exclusively bipedal as we think they are, meaning that they're capable of moving around on all fours as they are walking upright like us. And so you're almost like describing a hybrid type of species where it's not one or the other, but it's both. And it's like trying to have someone understand the internal combustion engine in 1930 in a Model T where it's all gasoline, but you're trying to explain to them a hybrid where it's got electric and gasoline. Back then they wouldn't understand, but today in 2019, it says, oh yeah, hybrid, yeah, electric and gas. When you're not using the gas, it goes all battery, And so that observation of a hybrid type of Bigfoot, where it's fully comfortable walking on all fours and fully comfortable walking on all two, that's seen in the literature way back to the earliest day.
Is there anything you are wanting to bring up that maybe you haven't figured out how to get into yet, but you wanted to say back then? Is there anything you want to cover?
Well, there's a lot of, they asked me to give a talk in Nebraska in February, which I did. And at the time, a fellow by the name of Don Monroe, who's 80 plus, gave a talk about Bigfoot braiding the hair, the manes on horses, braiding the manes, decorative designs and stuff. And all I could say is that I find that outrageous. I have yet to hear of any eyewitness actually stating that they've seen this. And I have spoken to one owner of horses that says that this braiding of hair is actually when when the manes get tangled up, and that it's not uncommon for them to get tangled up like that, and you have to go and brush them out. And it's just, as I was telling a colleague just yesterday, I said, I doubt if Bigfoot has the time to go braid the manes of horses. If anything, it's going to use a horse as a food supply, nothing more, nothing less. When I hear these things, I have trouble with it. When I hear that Bigfoot is making all these elaborate teepee structures in the woods, I have trouble with it in the sense that, well, maybe this is so, but is there an eyewitness with a name that has reported this? When you see just these structures, it's just like, well, you don't know what made it. And to say that Bigfoot made it is maybe trying to make a leap of faith. And so if someone said that a reliable witness had direct observation of making some elaborate teepee structure out in the woods that you could question and interview, then I'd say, like, okay, we should consider this. And the other thing is about the connection between UFOs and Bigfoot. There have been in the past a couple of cases where the two have been seen in the vicinity of one another, but like someone pointed out to me, that maybe that has nothing to do with Bigfoot at all. It might just be entirely a different phenomenon altogether. And it just happens to be that whatever they're dropping from their UFOs happens to look like Bigfoot. But I don't think Bigfoot is some being from some extraterrestrial civilization. I suspect that it's just another resident of the planet that has been here for a very long time, like us.
Well, while we're on the topic, let's get your thoughts on the infamous cloaking scandal. What's your position on cloaking?
Can you explain a little bit?
You get a lot of witnesses that swear that Bigfoot can essentially disappear, that they can appear and disappear at will. And yeah, the term is cloaking. To me, that has always been either, I can explain it either by the witness not having a clear view, or the animal is actually pretty adept at hiding, things like that. But it seems like the internet community especially has just taken this football and run with it. And as an older, seasoned researcher, I'm wondering if you have an opinion on that.
I do. And I think a lot of quotes around this, researchers and investigators, quotes around that too, that this idea of cloaking is, how can you say it? As I was speaking with Adam Davies in San Diego just the other day, I said, it's their hopes and wishes as what they want it to be rather than what it is. And it's just like in the real world, the world that you and I live in, I mean, people don't disappear out in thin air, and neither do bears or lions or tigers for that matter. They're physically real and they don't disappear. I mean, they might go behind a tree and hide, but you know that it was a physical activity that did that, not some magic or anything like that. So a lot of people use those ideas to maybe draw attention to themselves, but I just don't take any credence in them. And it's just like when I start to hear that type of stuff, I just kind of steer clear.
Fair enough. That's a very good answer. And again, I go back to your experience here. I'm going to ask you another elephant in the room. What's your thoughts on the aggressive Bigfoot? That's been one, especially for the last, 10 years, ever since I'd say David Paulides published Missing 411. Do you agree with any of that, or?
Well, let's just put it this way. I find it extremely interesting. I'm not a huge fan of David Paulides. His first book, I think, was called, I'm looking at my library here, and I think it was called, I'm hoping to see the book right now, The Hoopa Bigfoot. I think that was published in...
Yes, I believe that's correct.
It was called The Hoopa Project by Dave Paulides, 2008. And it dealt with not missing children or stuff like that, but Bigfoot up in the Hoopa Indian Reservation, which is north of Willow Creek and south of the Patterson-Gimlin film site. But getting the idea of missing children that have been moved from, say, a campsite up to a great high elevation that are found later, I find it interesting. And in fact, a gentleman who's now deceased, the late captain of the Los Angeles County Law Enforcement Police Department, Ken Kuhn, who was featured prominently in John Green's 1978 book, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us. He had talked about this in his book that was published after his death, that just came out this year. He goes, I often wondered about missing children and stuff as to the connection, that if there is a connection to Bigfoot. And I'm open to the idea. It's just like, I don't know what all is taking place, but it's just like, I find it intriguing. But in terms of aggression, that specific behavior, all I could say is that, like people, the aggression in any given individual is different from one to another. So like with Bigfoot, I suspect that there might be more aggressive Bigfoot in certain areas than other areas. So the possibility of real aggressive Bigfoot, it doesn't bother me.
Do you have a theory or a guess that you kind of hold on to about what an estimate of population might be for these animals? Well,
I saw Dr. Jeff Meldrum in February of this year in Nebraska. he wasn't a speaker. He was there to sell merchandise, and he went with Brandon Tennant. And Brandon, I guess, is a neighbor of his, is in Idaho. And Brandon was there to sell Bigfoot T-shirts. And so we had a dinner conversation. And Jeff, we had this specific discussion over dinner. And Dr. Meldrum was of the opinion that population densities or population in general, you've got to base it on something. And I think he was trying to tie it into the bear population as to how many bears per square mile, per state or whatever. And I guess his rough estimate is that in North America, we probably have a few thousand of them. And then it's interesting because I did an interview with John Green for Fate magazine, and this was published, say, I guess around the mid-1990s. And then he told me in the interview that he says for the amount of reports, and this, mind you, this is the mid-1990s, he says for the amount of reports that are coming out of North America, Canada included, of course, there has to be hundreds of thousands of them. And in my mind, again, it's just like for the amount, again, keying off the amount of reports from Florida to Alaska to Washington to all the way up to Maine and up into the Canadian provinces, for the amount of reports that are being reported, not to mention the ones that are not reported, that you have to have a sizable population. And I would say 100,000 would be nothing. That it would be, in my mind, completely acceptable, scattered through North America. And it's just like, I don't see that as a very big number. And a lot of people might opine that if you have 100,000 of them, you'd be hitting them in cars all the time. And I disagree. I just think that 100,000 scattered throughout North America is still a very, very small population. So my estimate for population would have to be over 100,000 for the amount of reports that are being reported.
Now that brings up this follow-up question. What is your estimation, you think, of these animals' intelligence?
I would say outside of us in terms of primates, because people say, well, what are we dealing with, an ape or a man or something in between? And it's just like, forget about that for the moment. Just assume that what we're dealing with is a primate like you and I. We're primates. We're part of that group. And so are chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. So Bigfoot, as far as I'm concerned, is another primate. I would say they would be second in terms of intelligence. And it's just like, when you start to read some of the reports, you almost get the impression that there is a thought process that has to deal with the future, such as the case from 1980 up in British Columbia, where a hunter had shot one of these things. But prior to that, I can't think of his name right now, but he was a Native American, and Renee DeHinden went to investigate him. And what they had found up there was a carcass of a deer, or portions of a deer, I think, that was concealed under leaves. And so the thought process is that this thing is concealing food for a later time. And I admit that bears and other animals do that, but there's a process there of complex thinking, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I would say that in terms of intelligence, add to the fact that we haven't got a body to look at right now, that they would be extremely intelligent.
Let's switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about you yourself, sir. Oh, wait.
No, I'm sorry. Before you do that, I had another question.
Oh, well, go right ahead. I'm sorry, baby. Go ahead.
I was going to lead right into,
the fact you said that there are no bodies. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. And we go back to in February, I met for the first time. I hope I'm saying the investigator's name right because he gets the newsletter. John Worms from, I think he lives in Ontario, but he had direct access to a fellow who's now deceased by the name of Paul Shibaga. And right around 1941, Paul Shibaga, as a teenager, was with a small group of hunters. I think he was 17 at the time. They were illegally poaching moose. I guess they didn't have tags. And I guess the reason for that is because they were extremely poor and they were killing moose as a food to put on the table because that's what you did to stay alive. And so John Worms, if I'm saying his name correctly, did a videotaped interview with Paul Shibaga, which I think is just absolutely brilliant before he passed away. And so in that interview, Paul Shibaga comes out and says, you know, I'm an old man now. I know I'm gonna die one day, but I want to tell you what happened when I was younger, hunting. And he got separated from his hunting party, and he saw a moose, and he shot the moose, and it took off, and there was a blood trail. And then I think he said he saw it again in some alders, some trees or whatnot, and he shot again, and he thought he was shooting into the back end of it. And so this thing dropped, and he thought it was a moose. And so when he got up close, it wasn't a moose. It proved to be something that he had never seen before, which I think he said, holy buckets. And he says, I've never seen anything like that. And what he saw lying dead on the ground that he accidentally shot was a Bigfoot. Apparently, his bullet had landed in the spinal area and killed it instantly. And there it was lying on the ground, and he saw it, didn't have a camera at the time, and he thought maybe he had shot a person, a hairy person or something like that, and he just made a decision to keep quiet about it. But back then, in 1941, had he brought this to the attention of officials in that community or in that province, that the whole issue may have been resolved. But he was scared. He was an immigrant to the country. He came from another country, and he was illegally poaching moose. So he thought the best thing to do was to keep his mouth shut. And that story didn't come out till much later. And so what's interesting is that John, the investigator, John Worms, did a videotaped interview of him, which I saw, and I was very, very impressed. So in terms of where are the bodies, that could have been a body that could have resolved the entire matter back in 1940, 1941, before the war.
Let me ask you, when you look back over your career so far, are you satisfied with the way it has gone? Are you happy with the work that you've done, or do you have anything that's kind of nagging at you, like, hey, I wish I'd done this instead? Or
well, there's one of the projects that was kind of nagging at me a little bit, because I've had two other colleagues kind of pushing in this direction, because they know I have tremendous amount of files and newspaper clippings, was the Ape Canyon incident from 1924. And so I posted this to my BigFootTimes.net website. On the bottom, it's just a specific bibliography of all the sources on Ape Canyon, and it covers at least 5 pages or so. And I said, I wanted to get that done. And then my other thing I want to do is, because of Chad Arment's book, The Historical Bigfoot, I wrote to him in an email. I said, what we should do is we should publish free for the entire Bigfoot community of all the sources that we know of in newspaper clippings prior to 1958, of everything that goes back to probably the early 1800s to 1958, before Bigfoot was Bigfoot, of all these references to wild hairy men in North America. So this way, someone could just access this online and say like, oh, here's a 1924 report from Arkansas, but this one we know about, but here's a new one that someone found by doing some library research or going online on looking on newspaper archives. And I said, that would be wonderful. And I said, I would like to be involved in something like that. Right now, my current project is, and I've been working on this slowly, is a picture book on the Patterson-Gimlin film that I hope to have out next year. The late George Haas. Are you familiar with George Haas?
I am, but probably not as much as I should be. It's been a while since I had run across any of his work or anything.
But you've heard the name, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so he is in John Green's books. And so he was the co-founder of the Bay Area group, and he was one of your original Bigfoot researchers. And so in June of 1968, he went with John Green to the Patterson-Gimlin film site when John Green made his recreation film of Jim McLaren walking over the same path that the subject in the Patterson-Gimlin movie walked. And so George was there with a 35 millimeter camera shooting slides. None of those slides never found their way into any books. And he's shooting the film site not from where Roger Patterson was shooting but from a whole different angle where you see the film site like you've never seen it before. And so that's my current project, is to showcase a lot of his work, his slides in full color in a picture book on the Patterson-Gimlin film. So this will be something entirely new, not regurgitation of old material. It'll be all brand new. Even though these slides were shot in 1968, they've never been published in any book. And so since I own all this material now, that's my plan, is to publish this next year. That's my current project.
How do you feel about regurgitation of said material? I would imagine that if there are new people interested and they may be able to contribute to the community, the regurgitation would be a good thing.
Someone pointed out to me, a subscriber to the newsletter in Washington State, and I never really thought about it until she wrote a letter to the editor. And I said, because I think I was reviewing a book, and I said, this book is fine, except it's very repetitive in regurgitation of a lot of old material. And this lady wrote in, she says, but this material is new to me. And I never really thought about it. So maybe me and the seasoned Bigfooters have seen all this information before, but to someone like her, it's all brand new. So I guess it's a double-edged sword. You could look at it both ways.
You see, that's one thing that's part of our goal. I've been around in the Bigfoot community for a long time on a very low-key level, but I'm familiar with all of the older history that like you have referenced and everything else, the foundational that has built to everything that up to what we have today. But then I go out and I run into these people who may have just gotten into it 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe even newer, and they have absolutely no idea. To them, if it's not on Facebook or if it's not on TV, it is completely over their head. and it's just off of their radar. And I feel like there is a real need for the community to really try to essentially reintroduce, because so many people did not have the story that people of our generation did about how we came involved or what we read and what was available back then. Instead, they've been relying on what they can hear on their phones or on their computers. And it's misleading.
Yeah, and a lot of the information that's published on the internet, on Facebook or Facebook pages that are devoted to Bigfoot or websites, a lot of the information isn't necessarily as tight and as concise and precise and factual as one might hope. That it may be a takeoff from an old story, say about Albert Ostman from 1924, but with all these new twists and turns that have never been heard before that are just entirely what we would call fake news. So I always say, when you want to get to the bottom of things, always try to go back to primary sources. And it's just like, that's going to be the Achilles heel of a lot of the new people that get involved or want to be involved, is they're relying on information that isn't necessarily as good as it could be. So there's always that saying, always consider the source. So not everyone is a good source of information when it comes to this topic, unfortunately.
I have a question on that topic. I know before this interview, I went to Amazon, and I was only able to find one work by you on Amazon, at least as far as in a digital form in the Kindle book. Do you have plans to re-release your other work in a digital format or anything like that?
Yes, for the modern day readers. Yeah.
Probably, but you have to realize that I'm not an army of researchers. I'm just one person, and I get up and start my day. I usually get to work at 6, so I'm up at 4, and my activity as a union licensed electrician brings me home tired, so I only have so much energy to devote and do things. And one thing I will freely admit, I'm not the most internet savvy person. Like right now, I'm trying to edit my interview with John Green that I did in 1995 in this application called iMovie. And I'm finding that I have to go to YouTube to kind of learn things as to how to do it. And so the Amazon, digital, Kindle, and stuff like that, when Steve DeMarco and I did that with Amazon, as I recall, it was kind of a long and complicated process. And I said, if I ever do that again, I'll get someone else to do it, because that's not kind of my thing. When we're talking electrical or Bigfoot, that's my thing. When we're talking like all the clicks and stuff that you need to do to upload or Amazon, that's not necessarily my thing. But yes, eventually I can see the need or to put some of this stuff up on Amazon and stuff for readers to have access to. But it's not like, I don't really need to do anything like that because I make a very comfortable living as an electrician. So it's just not like I'm not scrambling for the next dollar like some of the other researchers that this seems to be their only thing.
I hear that story. So say I wanted to subscribe to your newsletter. How would I go about doing that?
The best way is to go to BigfootTimes.net. And a lot of people today have a PayPal account. So you could just sign up through PayPal, and it's $18.50 for the entire year. And the Bigfoot Times is the only paper newsletter in the world that is mailed out via the United States Postal Service, where you get it in the postal mail and you can physically hold the newsletter. There's no other newsletter in the world like this. All the newsletters, or if there are newsletters, are online that you could see online, but nothing that you could touch unless you printed it out yourself.
Okay. Let's see here.
I wanted to touch on one area. I think you said, what is the most, in your email to me, what is the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you in Bigfoot?
That's just what I was going to ask.
Well, I'm embarrassed at myself, and I'm embarrassed that I put my colleague Tom Steenberg in harm's way. So this goes back to about mid-1990s, probably 97, 98, somewhere around there. So when I was in British Columbia, Tom and I decided to go out in the woods and to camp in an area where a bear hunter who claimed he had seen a Bigfoot through his rifle scope. And I think when we were there, it was maybe a year had passed. And so we decided to camp in an area and to go looking around. And so we did see one bear that crossed the trail, but it wasn't running after us, and it wasn't a grizzly bear. It was a small bear. It was just going through real quick. But we started exploring some caves, small caves. So we went in one cave, and so I was coming out first. We didn't really see much. And so as I was coming out, there was this big branch. And so I took and here it's funny because I knew Tom was behind me, but for whatever reason, I'm not thinking about that. So I took this branch and I pushed it out of my way. And so I get past the branch, and dummy me, I let it go. And so Tom is right behind me, and he smokes a pipe, and he had his pipe in his mouth. And so as it's swinging back, it just all of a sudden dawned on me. I said, oh my God, Tom's behind me. And it hit him in the face, and his smoking pipe was two pieces. And so the next thing I'm seeing Tom, and he's only got this little thing in his mouth, and the piece where you put your smoking stuff is laying on the ground. And I was really embarrassed because I said, I knew he was there, but temporarily I just completely forgot, and I whacked him.
That sounds like a hot situation.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Oh, my goodness.
So, yeah.
We all have moments like that.
We all have moments like that, and it's just like, I didn't really realize what I had done until I released that branch, but by then it was too late. But had you been there, it's just like it would have been both funny and embarrassing for me.
We will forgive you. It's okay. Don't worry. Now, I don't know about Thomas. Can't speak for him, but for the rest of us, you're okay.
We all do it.
Oh, yeah. All right, Daniel. And I always find this is an interesting question for people who investigate Bigfoot. We ask all of our guests this. What is your boogeyman? What is the monster under your bed or the monster in your closet? What's that kind of, I don't want to say inner demon, but what is it that just sends chills up your spine?
Gives you the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah.
Maybe meeting a Bigfoot without knowing that it's there. In other words, you're in the woods and all of a sudden it might be behind a tree and it steps out behind a tree and all of a sudden you're face to face with it 3 feet away. I don't know how I would react because I think if anything, more than likely it would be taller than my 5 feet 7 inches. And all of a sudden you come face to face with something hairy that's man-like, that's probably smelly and 7 or 8 feet tall. I think that would just send me or anyone else into a certain type of shock. Because I have seen basketball players, Walton, Shaq, and a couple of others that are 7 feet plus, Wilt Chamberlain as well, that when you see these people up close and personal, you realize how tall 7 feet is. And so to see something not just 7 feet, but with considerable bulk on it, it's just like, that would be the ultimate boogeyman, to come face to face with something like that without seeing it first, with it, something like might be stepping behind a tree, stepping out from behind a tree, and all of a sudden, boom, it's happening right there. And that would be the ultimate boogeyman for me. I wouldn't want that to happen.
I can understand that.
Oh, no, sir.
I don't think any investigator would want that to happen. And I think you deserve a prize, because you are the first person, I think, that's actually brought up Bigfoot as
that
being the boogeyman.
Yeah, that's a gold star right there, Daniel.
You have just earned and solidified your Bigfoot researcher credential. Most of us aren't smart enough to say that, and you did. That's pretty awesome.
A situation nobody would want to be in.
No, and I
yeah.
appreciate that. Daniel, what are your plans going forward, real quick?
To continue to publish the newsletter, the BIGFOOT Times, on a monthly basis, and we're approaching 25 years, a quarter century of publishing, and I want to continue to publish at least another quarter century. And I think that's going to be the body of work that's going to be my legacy. But plans going forward, too, is also to do more field work, because as I mentioned to Adam Davies, I said DNA hair samples is not going to solve the Bigfoot mystery. And the only thing that's going to resolve it is a body. And it's just like, unfortunately, I think that's the ultimate thing that needs to be done, is that someone needs to bring a body in. And that is where my focus is.
Okay.
Would you be one of the ones comfortable bringing the body in, or are you more of the type that would sit back and let, say, a professional hunter do it?
Or conversely, just wait till it's accidentally done.
Exactly.
To me, it doesn't matter. I don't go in the woods as often as a lot of other Bigfoot hunters, but I just think that the way I see it, I mean, you've seen in the past a lot of this information that says, well, this DNA or this blood sample or this hair sample proves that Bigfoot is real, but it really hasn't pushed the boundary. It hasn't really taken us to the goalpost like we wanted it to be. But I think a body would satisfy skeptics and believers alike and in the world. And I just think that that's what needs to happen.
Okay.
At least that's my opinion. And I can't say I'm not a bloodthirsty individual, but it's just like, without a body, Bigfoot will continue to remain this mythological figure that a lot of people think is just like Santa Claus.
No, it's a logical conclusion. A body equals scientific proof.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. The proof is the truth. And until that time comes, it's an open dialogue. And it's just like, I'm hoping that something like that might happen in the future, because it would definitely stamp out or weed out a lot of these, what we would call woo ideas about Bigfoot, cloaking, braiding, and all these other ideas that I think are what people hope and wish Bigfoot is, rather than what it really is.
Let me ask you, This is one thing I thought about when you were talking earlier, and I wanted to get your stance on it. How do you feel about everyone going out and recording audio now? I mean, that's the single easiest thing for anybody to go out and do. Right. How do you feel about that?
After hearing a discussion prior to 2017, I wasn't really too keen on audio recordings. And in 2008, myself in the presence of Mike Rugg from the Felton Bigfoot Museum here in California, we went, myself and Mike Rugg and a couple of other people went to investigate a report of a Bigfoot nest, summer of 2008, south of Felton, California. And so we went with the eyewitness who said that there was this Bigfoot nest. And when we got there, it just proved to be someone had taken a rake and had piled up a bunch of brush, and he thought it was a Bigfoot nest. And so we said, okay, there's nothing to this. And so as we were about to leave, we're standing on a 2-lane highway. And we're standing in the middle of the 2-lane highway because there's absolutely no traffic on it. And to get off the 2-lane highway would just take a few steps. And so we're just kind of talking one to one another. And one of the guys there has his videotape camera. But the videotape camera, the lens is pointing to the pavement. And he doesn't realize that the camera is still rolling. And that at that time, in the surrounding area is this phenomenal sound that we heard. I don't know what it was, but something was yelling or sounding. And it's kind of like a submarine type of sound underwater. It was just weird. And I looked at the people who were in front of me and I go, wow, what was that? And as this sound went off and it continued for maybe 20 seconds or so, you could hear, I think in the area, 2 dogs that kind of reacted to the sound. And we captured the sound with that video recorder. And I thought that was extremely interesting. But I didn't know what to do with that information. But in 2017, when I went to the International Bigfoot Conference in Washington over Labor Day weekend, a fellow, if I'm not mistaken with his name, David Ellis, was talking about analysis of sounds that have been attributed to Bigfoot. And in terms of taking those sounds and analyzing them with tools to see what those sounds might be, comparing them to other animals, because apparently there's a big sound library out there. And he made a very interesting case about that the sounds could be very interesting and very useful. And so I said, it probably doesn't hurt to get recordings of sounds, and who knows? And so, yeah, I don't have any objections to sounds. And it's just like, I think it's interesting. And David, it's more his expertise than mine. But he seems to be going down that road in terms of analyzing sounds. And I said, if we could put more time into it and more analysis into sounds, that could prove to be something that might be worthy of more discussion in the future.
Okay. We're about to tie up.
Okay.
Have you actually figured out a Bigfooter of the year yet? I'm not saying announce it. You don't have to announce it. You don't have to tell me. I'm just curious because I've been following in Coalition all the Kip jokes and everything else about it, and I'm just personally curious. Do you have one yet, or have you had one in mind?
We have the person. The person has been selected, and again, it's I say me, myself, and I as the editorial team, but essentially we're talking about one person. So that will be the selection for the Bigfoot Times as our Bigfooter of the year, and by Christmas time, we'll all know who that person is.
Okay, that was going to be my next question.
What a present. Congratulations to that future Bigfooter.
I was curious when the announcement would be made.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Daniel, I want to really thank you for giving us this interview. It has been very enlightening.
We
thank
really
you for having me.
Yes, thank you very much for giving us of your time and of your knowledge, because we like to share it forward, and we appreciate the mutual respect with everything, sharing it forward.
Well, I hope it proves to be an interesting interview for the Bigfoot community that wants to listen to someone who's been around the block a few times.
It will.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, sir.
Have a good night.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Bye-bye. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Guests of Cryptid Connection are all members of the Cryptid Connection website. Join the community, a safe, secure, and private place for all your paranormal and cryptid pursuits.
Every cowboy, he always misses when he's aiming at the target in his head. And every broken man finds his idle hands grasping at tomorrow's promised land. And I've been thinking about running, and I'll get out on the town just for myself. And that's when I saw her, and she looked right through me. And when I said I do that day, I really do. 'Cause every cowboy, he always misses his shot when he's aiming at the target in his head. And every broken man finds his idle hands grasping at tomorrow's promised land. And I've been thinking about writing, and when I get the first draft back with no red ink, but I've been thinking to do my best work. Yeah, I've gotta leave this town to find my way. And when that plane touched down on that island town, I knew that my life's work was in their hands. So I started digging for wells of water, and I'm a hero in their eyes. It's clear to see. 'Cause every cowboy, he always misses his shot when he's aiming at the target in his head. And every broken man finds his idle hands grasping at tomorrow's promised land. And I've been thinking about the time that I have wasted sitting here. 'Cause 'Cause I've been thinking that all this thinking is the thing that keeps me further from myself.
The music and soundtrack for the opening is from Epic Film Score by Alex Kaskin. The closing credits are Every Cowboy by Cellophane Sam.